Welcome to the Daily News Currents. Today is Tuesday, April 1st, and for today's headlines we have 4 astronauts to be the first to orbit the poles in a privately funded SpaceX mission, entire staff at federal agency that funds libraries and museums put on leave, White House says its case closed on the Signal group chat review, Trump administration will review billions in funding for Harvard, what we know about Marine Le Pen's embezzlement conviction. 4 astronauts to be the first to orbit the poles on a privately funded SpaceX mission. In a mission funded and commanded by cryptocurrency entrepreneur Chun Wang, SpaceX said it plans to launch as early as Monday evening, making the first crewed mission to polar orbit and the first to cultivate mushrooms as a crop in space. The 3 to 5 day flight is to be lofted into space by a Falcon 9 booster. The mission is named after Fram, a steam and sail-powered ship used by Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen during his historic 1910 to 1912 expedition to the South Pole. A 4-person international team will crew the Fram 2 mission, weighing from Malta, Jackie Mikkelsen, a film director and cinematographer from Norway, Rabo Rajes, an electrical engineer, robotic researcher, and polar scientist from Germany, and Eric Phillips, a polar explorer and private astronaut from Australia. The polar orbit means the spacecraft will circle the Earth over the North Pole in Antarctica, unlike previous missions that orbited west-east, roughly parallel to the equator. Although astronauts have not flown in polar orbits before, such orbits are common for satellites conducting Earth observation and mapping, weather data collection, and environmental monitoring because they cover the entire planet. The ionizing radiation dose will certainly be higher over the poles, according to Kevin Lewis, a planetary scientist and associate professor at Johns Hopkins University. However, the dose rate is likely only a few times higher, and for a short-duration flight wouldn't likely be a concern, outside of perhaps extreme solar flares, he explains, referring to sudden intense explosions on the sun that can send a stream of charged particles, X-rays, and gamma rays speeding towards Earth. Among the 22 studies and experiments planned for the short mission, one will capture radiation measurements inside the Dragon spacecraft and assess individual radiation exposure levels of each crew member. Another study, carried out on behalf of Food IQ Global, will attempt to cultivate oyster mushrooms aboard the capsule. Space nutritionist and Food IQ Global CEO Dr. Flavia Ferret-Moore says that while mycelium has been grown in microgravity aboard the International Space Station Fram 2, marks the first time that mushrooms will be cultivated as a crop. Ferret-Moore refers to mushrooms as a perfect space crop, explaining that the way they grow and complement planet systems is really perfect for exploration missions to the Moon and Mars. Mushrooms also have a natural ability to make vitamin D when exposed to ultraviolet light, which is important for astronauts to counter bone loss in space, she says. Oyster mushrooms were selected for study because they are resilient, easy to grow, and quick to reach maturity, she says. Ferret-Moore's jokes that about 20% of people say they don't like mushrooms, and that the astronaut selection criteria are already difficult enough without placing, must be willing to eat mushrooms on long-duration flights to the list. Liftoff for the Fram 2 mission will occur from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. The launch window opens at 9:46 p.m. Eastern Time on Monday, with additional opportunities for launch until 2:26 a.m. Eastern on Tuesday. If the launch is scrubbed, SpaceX might try again, beginning at 9:46 p.m. Eastern on Tuesday. Entire staff at federal agency that funds libraries and museums put on leave. The Institute of Museum and Library Services has placed its entire staff on administrative leave. The IMLS is a relatively small federal agency with about 70 employees that awards grant funding to museums and libraries across the country. Earlier this month, President Trump named Keith E. Soderling, Deputy Secretary of Labor, the new acting director of IMLS. This follows Trump's previous executive order, shrinking 7 federal agencies, including the Institute of Museum and Library Services. According to a statement from AFGE Local 3403, which represents IMLS workers, the agency's staff were notified by email about the administrative leave via a brief meeting between DOGE staff and the IMLS leadership. Employees had to turn in government property, and email accounts were disabled. What is IMLS? The IMLS is an independent federal agency that provides grants to libraries and museums across the country. According to the American Library Association, the IMLS provides a majority of federal library funds. The IMLS says it has awarded $266 million in grant funding and research to cultural institutions last year. The money goes to help staff, maintenance, and create new programs. For instance, in 2023, the IMLS funded projects such as a workforce training program at the Museum of Discovery and Science in Orlando, a pilot program in Iowa to help library staff address patron psychological needs, and basic library functions, books, computers, internet, for various Native American tribes. You can find programs that IMLS has funded to libraries and museums in your state through their dashboard. According to the advocacy group Every Library, public libraries are primarily funded by city and county taxes, and federal funds account for a much smaller portion of libraries' budgets. However, the group issued a statement following President Trump's executive order, saying that without this core federal funding for state libraries and museums and archives, we risk losing critical programs and services in every state. According to the AFGE Local 3403, the status of grants that were previously awarded is unclear, and the union statement said without staff to administer the programs, it will most likely that grants will be terminated. Steve Patosh is the CEO of Overdrive, which distributes digital products such as audiobooks, ebooks, and movies to libraries. He said in an interview that small and rural libraries will be mostly affected by cuts to federal funding. When a public library which has growing demand for their online and digital materials is getting any kind of budget cuts, hard decisions have to be made, said Patosh. White House says its case closed on the Signal group chat review. The White House has concluded its review of how Atlantic editor Jeffrey Goldberg was inadvertently included in a Signal message group chat of high-ranking officials discussing impending strikes in Yemen. The Atlantic story, published 1 week ago, stunned Washington because of the sensitive nature of the information disclosed on the app. The White House has said none of the information was classified. The case has been closed here at the White House for as far as we're concerned, Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt told reporters on Monday. There have been steps made to ensure that something like that can obviously never happen again, and we're moving forward, she said. Leavitt did not offer details about what steps the White House is taking after the review. Last week, she had told reporters that the National Security Council, the White House counsel's office, and Trump's advisor Elon Musk were all looking into how the mishap happened. Leavitt said Trump's national security advisor Mike Waltz, who created the group chat and added Goldberg to it, continues to be an important part of Trump's national security team. Trump administration will review billions in funding for Harvard. The move follows the cancellation of roughly $400 million in funding for Columbia and suspension of $175 million for the University of Pennsylvania. The Trump administration said on Monday that it is reviewing roughly $9 billion in federal grants and contracts awarded to Harvard, claiming that the school had allowed anti-Semitism to run unchecked on its campus. In a statement on Monday, the administration said it was examining about $256 million in contracts, as well as another $8.7 billion in what it described as multi-year grant commitments. While Harvard's recent actions to curb institutionalized anti-Semitism, though long overdue, are welcome, there is much more that the university must do to retain the privilege of receiving federal taxpayers' hard-earned dollars, Josh Grunbaum, a senior official at the General Services Administration, said in a statement. This administration has proven that we will take swift action to hold institutions accountable if they allow anti-Semitism to fester, he added. We will not hesitate to act if Harvard fails to do so. Alan M. Garber, Harvard's president, was not immediately available for comment, but he has previously emphasized the importance of federal money to the university's operation. We could not carry our mission the way we do now without sustainable federal research support, nor could we provide the benefits to the nation we do now without that support, Dr. Garber said in a December interview with the Harvard Crimson, the campus newspaper. The threatened action against Harvard followed a decision made public on March 7th to cut about $400 million in funding for Columbia due to the school's continued inaction in the face of persistent harassment of Jewish students. Desperate to restart the funding, Columbia agreed 2 weeks later to comply with preconditions demanded by the administration, a step towards regaining the money. Harvard and Columbia are among the 10 universities that a federal task force said on February it was reviewing because of possible anti-Semitic activity on campuses. Soon after, Harvard said it was placing a freeze on staff and faculty hiring, given the uncertain environment. Even so, the university, which has an endowment fund of more than $50 billion, said it was increasing its financial aid package for students. Under the new plan, students whose families have income of $200,000 and under are eligible for free tuition, placing Harvard among the nation's most generous schools. The administration's attack on universities has profound implications for the First Amendment and the government's power to police protests, even when they occur on private campuses. There are also likely to be enormous economic and academic repercussions. Although private philanthropy is important, federal funding has long been the lifeblood of American academic research, and university leaders have warned that few schools can continue marshaling the financial firepower for projects if Washington stops helping with the bills. Shutdowns, even temporary ones, of research programs could lead to new layoffs, hiring freezes, and could trickle through local economies. But the administration came to power in January, bristling with rage towards the most elite realms of American higher education. As candidates, President Trump depicted top schools as overrun by Marxists, maniacs, and lunatics. The Vice President J.D. Vance derided them as insane. Mr. Trump and Mr. Vance both hold degrees from Ivy League universities. And Mr. Trump subsequently vowed on social media that all federal funding will stop for any college, school, or university that allows illegal protest. Other schools targeted by the Anti-Semitism Task Force were George Washington University, Johns Hopkins University, New York University, Northwestern University, the University of California, Los Angeles, the University of California, Berkeley, the University of Minnesota, and the University of Southern California. Columbia's acquisitions without a court fight was widely seen as something akin to a permission slip for the federal office to go after other universities. Campus leaders across the country have been preparing for bitter disputes with Washington, which finances most university research in the United States and plays an essential role in the student financial aid system. In the wake of agreement with the Trump administration, Katrina Armstrong, Columbia's acting president, relinquished her post. Although most of the administration's focus has been on what it sees as an endemic anti-Semitism on American campuses, it also paused about $175 million in funding for the University of Pennsylvania because it allowed a transgender woman onto its women's swim team in 2022. What we know about Marine Le Pen's embezzlement conviction. The far-right French politician was a leading candidate to become the country's next president, but has now been barred from running for public office for 5 years. Marine Le Pen, the leader of France's far right and a leading candidate to become the country's next president, has been barred from running for public office for 5 years after she and her party were convicted of embezzling millions of euros of European Union funds. Ms. Le Pen, an anti-immigrant populist politician, was also sentenced to 4 years in prison, with 2 years suspended and 2 that could be served under house arrest, and fined €100,000, or about $108,000. She had consistently denied any wrongdoing and will appeal the verdict, which would put her jail sentence and fine on hold. But the ruling against Ms. Le Pen and her party, the National Rally, threatens to ruin her plans to run for presidency in 2027. She had spent years trying to soften her party's image and move it into the mainstream by disavowing its anti-Semitic roots after succeeding her father as leader for France's far right. Who was Marine Le Pen? Ms. Le Pen, 56, became the face of France's far right after taking over the party in 2011 from her father, Jean-Marie Le Pen. Ms. Le Pen has fought to detoxify the political movement he built by softening some of his policies, changing the name of the party from the National Front to the National Rally, publicly rejecting her father's anti-Semitism. He was convicted by a French court of Holocaust denial for saying that the Nazi gas chambers were a detail of history and trying to court disaffected voters. But even if the tone has changed, Ms. Le Pen's platform is still staunchly hard-right. Her policies include using severe measures to curb immigration and pushing for French-born citizens to have more rights to social benefits and other areas of state support, even though some argue that this could violate the French Constitution. Ms. Le Pen has run for the country's highest office 3 times, and although she has yet to win, she succeeded in steadily increasing her share of the vote and expanding her party's reach. In the last presidential election in 2022, she won 41.5% of the vote, up from 33.9% in the previous election 5 years earlier. Last year, the National Rally became the biggest single party in the National Assembly, the country's lower house of parliament, for the first time. What were the charges? A French criminal court ruled that Ms. Le Pen played a central role in the illegal scheme by the party, when it was still called the National Front, to use the equivalent of almost $5 million of European Parliament funds for party expenses between 2004 and 2016. The party was short of cash at the time, and Ms. Le Pen was a member of the European Parliament from 2004 to 2017. The court found that the party used European Parliament funds to pay assistance to National Front members of the body for work that was unrelated to EU business. The judges rejected Ms. Le Pen's argument that it was appropriate for the assistants to do party-related work. Benedict de Pelotheus, the presiding judge, called the ban necessary because of the seriousness of the charges and the fact that the accused seemed unwilling to acknowledge the facts. The court has to ensure that elected officials, like any citizen, do not benefit from any favorable treatment, she said. Ms. Le Pen had called the case a political witch hunt. What's next for Ms. Le Pen and her party? Ms. Le Pen left the court before the full verdict was read out and did not address the reporters as she departed. She is set to speak on French television later on Monday. The ruling does not strip her of her seat in the National Assembly, but Ms. Le Pen will only be able to run for president in 2027 if she secures a more favorable ruling on appeal before the deadline to enter the race. But even a successful appeal could take some time. The court also ruled that the National Rally had to pay a 2 million euro fine, half of which would be suspended. 23 other people were convicted on charges related to the scheme to embezzle European Parliament funds. The ruling does not bar Jordan Bardella, Ms. Le Pen's 29-year-old protege, from running for president in her absence. He is seen as the leading alternative candidate. Where does this leave France? The ruling could ignite the political chaos that roiled France last year after President Emmanuel Macron called snapped elections. The French president is not popular and struggled to pass a budget this year. It could be toppled by lawmakers in the National Assembly. Ms. Le Pen and the National Rally could also paint the verdict as a threat against a popular politician and party and French democracy itself. That is all that we have for you today. Thank you so much for listening. Goodbye.